Gators Breakdown episode 85 is ready to go. Now, I'm your host, David Waters, and you can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC, and it's Wednesday night, and some of you will get this on Thursday morning, but for this episode, it will be Will Miles. You can find Will on Twitter at WillMilesSEC. He's from SEC Country. You can check his work out there. Will, like I said last week, we're going to make this a weekly occurrence, so thanks for joining me again, and we'll have many more to come.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Can't wait. Well, we got a little bit of football this Saturday, but the big one's coming up in a week and a half.
Yeah, just a little appetizer this weekend, and I'm kind of eager to see South Florida play. Charlie Strong's going in there. I'll peek in at that game, but I have to give my wife and family one more weekend before the gauntlet hits.
Oh, I am in the exact same place. I am not going to be watching any football at all this weekend. It's going to be a respite for the kids until the season starts.
Yeah, we went for a walk around the neighborhood. My wife was like, "Yeah, I want to cook out this weekend and all that stuff." I said, "Okay." I said, "We can do it." I was like, "If I can keep my eye on football, I will, but I won't go out of my way to do it."
Sounds good. Same thing here.
Yeah. All right. Before we can dive into this one, remember you can find all your Gators Breakdown episodes on SoundCloud, iTunes, and YouTube. Just search on those sites or get the links by following Gators Breakdown on Twitter and on Facebook at Gators Breakdown. Also, when on iTunes, please rate and review the show. Let Gator Nation know what they're getting out there with Gators Breakdown. Well, before we dive into our two main topics, it was kind of a hot button topic today. Jim McElwain had his press conference, and of course, the quarterback, however you want to say, fiasco, event, all kind of different words, triumvirate. What happens there? The three-headed monster. It seems to be whittled down to two if you read some insider reports of what's going on there. Felipe Franks, Luke Del Rio, Malik Zaire is kind of falling behind a little bit, not really knowing the playbook as well as we thought he may at this point, not in sync with the receivers, not as accurate as you want him to be right now either. But Jim McElwain's not really letting anyone know what the plan is going to Michigan, nor should he. But it's still going to get on some fans' nerves out there that Florida has not picked a quarterback yet. You would like a quarterback to take the bull by the horns and take the reins, and if that may have happened, I do think it's a close battle between Franks and Del Rio. But maybe if one of those guys had come out and really grabbed the bull by the horns and really, really separated themselves, you might know. But as close as it is, and it's a big game against Michigan, and we know what Jim Harbaugh is doing and not releasing a roster, let alone a depth chart, but not a roster at all to kind of know. But you can go pick up a preseason magazine and know what Michigan's got coming back. But quotes from Jim McElwain today. You're going to see a bunch of them in there playing. I mean, the three guys have done a really good job. I think there's some things they all bring to the table that are really good. Now, the key to us is putting them in those positions to play to their strengths. Don't read into this that we're not happy where they're at. It's the competition that really brought out some good things. Will all play? I don't know yet. Will a couple of them play? I don't know yet. I know we will have somebody at the position. So, it does seem there's a possibility Franks, Del Rio, Zaire may all play in that first game against Michigan.
I think McElwain's just screwing with all of us. I think at this point he's just trying to throw Harbaugh off the scent. I'm guessing he has an idea of who he's going to start. I'm not quite sure why he feels the need to antagonize the Gator fan base, because I think there's enough people who just either want the battle to be over or want people to not necessarily talk about it. That stay quiet if you don't know who it is, and then if you do, name them. But at the end of the day, I think he's got a pretty good idea of who's going to play. There might be some red zone packages for Zaire, particularly in some instances where maybe you've got Tony back there too, so you got a couple of people in there. Make Michigan take a timeout, something like that. But I don't necessarily see, if it's Del Rio or Franks who start, I don't see Zaire seeing a whole lot of time in that game. So, the reality is we haven't seen much of the practices, and
Yep.
we don't really know what's going on, and that's kind of the whole point, right? McElwain wants to keep it that way, and that's his right to do it. But then it's our right to complain about it on Twitter when we just want to know who's going to actually start the game.
I'm glad you said that. With the limited access, we're left with nothing but to speculate. That's kind of just how it is now. There's Don't get me wrong. Florida's not the only program to do it. Not by far. There are many programs out there do not allow access to what's going on out there. Should they? That's a topic for another day. But we really do not know what's going on. And can you believe what's coming out of camp and out of practice? Yes, there are some inside reports, but how many years has it been? We've heard inside reports that quarterbacks look good, and it's going on since Tim Tebow that the quarterback play has been subpar. And there are many different reasons for that, but that is the case. So, if it's Franks, you're going with somebody who doesn't have the experience, and it seems to be a high risk, high reward type of play you're getting with Felipe Franks. If it's Del Rio, you're going with somebody who has some experience. Maybe the biggest game of his career was probably last year's Florida-Georgia game, and was not a great showing by any means. He was supposed to be the guy who could take care of the ball, be safe with the ball, but after the injury, and even against Kentucky game where he played good, he got away with a couple passes that should have been picked off, and I think he ended up having more interceptions and touchdowns last year. And then Malik Zaire, we know his seems to be limitations right now of picking up the offense, but we know he's a threat with his legs. So you got three guys there that can bring something to the table. If Franks is the starter, I do think you see some Zaire. If Luke Del Rio is the starter, I think you see some Zaire. As you mentioned, some red zone packages there. But it's going to be – isn't an indictment – if Luke Del Rio starts, is it an indictment of Zaire and Franks that these guys are not where they should be? Or, from going back to what we saw last year, that's why a lot of people think that it's an indictment of Felipe Franks not being up to par, Malik Zaire not being up to par. Is there any inkling out there that we can say maybe Luke Del Rio has taken another step and he can be a quarterback Florida can count on?
Yeah, I mean, I understand why people would say that, but you and I talked on an episode, I don't know, a month or two ago about an article I wrote about Del Rio and giving him a second shot. That his statistics last year didn't match what his track record has been in the past, particularly when you look at his track record of accuracy in high school. Now we can parse whether he's got the arm strength, and certainly he's got some opinions on that as well, which is one of the other things that seems to rile up the Gator fan base too. So we can talk about whether he's got the arm strength to do what he needs to do, but the reality is that the Gator quarterbacks who really have been the legends aren't guys who had giant arm strength. They're guys who had charisma. They're guys who could lead the troops, and they're guys who had certainly had quite a bit of talent. I mean, I don't mean to say that Werfel and Tebow didn't have a lot of talent, but they aren't guys who had rocket arms. So I don't know that that's necessarily the absolute be all end all. If Del Rio wins the job, he wins the job. You got to trust that the coach who you've put in place, a guy who's been an offensive coordinator, who's had offenses that have been really successful, is going to put the best guy for the job in there. That's why he brought in Zaire. If Zaire had played really well, I have to believe Zaire would be the one who's starting. So, I think it's a little bit of an indictment of Franks and Zaire if Del Rio comes in and wins the job. But at the end of the day, as a Florida fan, you just want the best player out there on the field, give them the best shot to win the game. And, hell, if they score 40 points, I don't care who's quarterbacking.
I don't either. And that's the one thing I'm glad you brought up. If you're a Jim McElwain fan, I guess if Luke Del Rio is the one starting out there, you have to trust that it is the right decision, that there's nothing more behind it, that he's just the one who outperformed the other two guys, and you go from there. I know it's a scary proposition from Gator fans from what we saw last year, but right now, if you had to tell me to pick, and I've even said this before, it's blind faith, but we have a little more that's coming out there. I'm still on the Felipe Franks train, not by much, but if you tell me I had to pick a starter to go with, that's who I would roll with, and I would say maybe the coaches do that too, but it's really just a guess at this point.
Well, and I would say Bill's mentioned this, that the people who are behind Franks are really sort of buying into the McElwain vision, right? Yeah. That this is Mac's first big quarterback recruit. It's somebody he said needed some seasoning. Now he's gotten some seasoning, and he should be ready to go. But you've talked to Jaquez Green about this, and he's sort of talked about quarterbacks not really being ready until they're juniors and seniors, and that the redshirt year and a couple of years of sitting on the bench is a valuable thing, and that we don't really give players time to do that anymore. So I don't know that this is an indictment of Franks. I mean, I think the problem is that if Franks isn't the one who takes the reins by the end of the year, you're back at square one with Matt Corral, which may be a good thing, but he's not coming through the door this year, so you just got to play the best guy. Unless you're preparing for the future. So, you get halfway through the year and you're not making a major bowl game or something like that because of your record, then maybe you throw the young guy in there just to see what you got. But I think to start the year, you got to put in the guy who's playing the best in camp, because that's what you say you're going to do in every position, right?
Yeah, that is true. That is true. We're going to put in more quarterback play and discussion coming up in the shows ahead. But we'll move on from that and move on to Will. You published your most recent article on SEC Country this past Monday. I think your article comes out every Monday, right? Yep. And it's about how Jim McElwain wins the close games. And one thing I'm glad you did, and it was right off the top of the article, was you dispelled the notion that Jim McElwain was lucky in winning close games.
Well, so if you look at close games, they're defined as games that are decided by 7 points or less. It's an arbitrary definition, but it's a one-score game, right? So, and you look at that, and McElwain's gone 7-1 at Florida, and he went 8-3 at Colorado State. So he's won almost 80% of his games that have been close. You look at most teams, and they usually win around 50%. In the SEC last year, it was 31-30. Was the record. Over the past 2 years, only 55% of those games have been won. And if you look at Georgia, they've won 69% of those games. So Georgia has won more close games than other teams. But really, they're usually a flip. They're a coin flip, right? You win one, you lose one. That's usually the way it goes. And McElwain has won at such an impressive clip that I wanted to take a look at the film and say, okay, what is he doing that gives his team an edge? And, really the things that he's doing are he's playing the numbers to a point where he's getting an advantage for a team that, quite honestly, especially 2 years ago, had significantly less talent than some of the teams that they were playing, particularly after the Greer suspension. And so you could see him making decisions that put Florida in an advantageous situation, particularly on fourth downs. The Kentucky game from 2015 is the one that came immediately to mind when I was thinking about this, that he went for it on fourth down multiple times, converted those drives into 2 touchdowns, and Florida wins the game 14-9. And if they had settled for field goals, well, first off, in 2015, they probably don't make them. But also, had they settled for field goals, they're sitting there in a 9-6, 6-6 dogfight trying to win.
And you say, and you going with that, that's probably part of him going for it on fourth down was because of the lack of field goal kicker.
Well, I certainly think so, but there are some examples in the article. So last year against Florida State, they drove all the way down the field to the 2-yard line, and they went for it on fourth down. And the conventional wisdom is on that opening drive, you got to make your guys feel good. You got to take the 3 points. That not putting the points on the board is a cardinal sin. But when you actually look at the math, it makes sense to go for it on fourth and goal from the 3 every time, regardless of the time in the game. The only time you wouldn't is if you're down by 2,
right?
And it's late in the fourth quarter, right?
The common sense plays.
Right, but in the middle of the game, at a point where the goal is to score more points than your opponent, touchdowns are worth more than field goals. It seems like common sense, but most coaches don't do that, and so. You can say, oh, he had a bad field goal kicker in 2015. But one of the things I found really encouraging last year, particularly in that Florida State game, is he turned down the 3 points. And he said, no, I understand the math. I need to score the 7 here. I'm going to score the 7 here. And if I don't, Florida State's going to have to start from their own 3. And in fact, that's what happened. Florida State started from their own 3, drove about 60 yards, and wound up missing a really long field goal. Whereas if Florida had kicked a field goal, then kicked off, and Florida State has the same drive, well, they're inside Florida's 10 if they have the exact same drive. So, the reality is where you leave your opponent is almost as important as whether you convert the fourth down or not. Now, obviously, you'd like to convert it, but that's not necessarily always the goal. The goal is to do what's mathematically the most correct. And so, if you look at McElwain, he's averaged 1.6 fourth down attempts per game in his 5 years as a head coach. And if you look at Will Muschamp, he averages 1.26 fourth downs per game. he averaged more than 2 at South Carolina last year, and not coincidentally went 4-2 in close games at South Carolina. So he averaged 1.1 fourth downs per game when he was at Florida, and that's even with a season where they went 4-8. So they should have been going for fourth down a lot while they were behind. So Muschamp was ultra conservative. He punted a lot when I don't think he had to or when it didn't make sense to. And Florida didn't win those little battles on the edges that McElwain has won. And it's reflected in their record. If you look at point differentials, McElwain shouldn't have won as much. So the expected win percent for McElwain based on the point differential is 64%, and he's actually won 70% of his games. And Muschamp, his expected win percent is 61%. He's only won 57% of his games. So really, that 13% spread, which is really people saying, wow, McElwain is better than Muschamp, has very little to do with the actual performance of the teams, either offensively or defensively. It's all that stuff along the edges where he's gaining those little edges. And there are some examples later in the article of timeout usage and different things like that. Where that really comes into play. And so he's probably worth a couple of points a game when he's out there coaching, just based on the decisions that he's making.
Hey, and you mentioned the games, and I'll go through and look back at those. His first close game was the second game of his career, or at Florida. Jim McElwain here, beating East Carolina 31-24, and then the Kentucky game you mentioned 14-9. And then the next week, when you mentioned how aggressive on fourth down he was, again, we all remember where the fourth downs really came into play was the 28-27 win against Tennessee, and how you called in your article, and we can all go back and look at that game where Butch Jones wasn't aggressive. And if he would have been a little more aggressive in that fourth quarter, going for a 2-point conversion and getting it, Florida's probably not in position to come back and win that game. And earlier in the game, I think you had another example as well where Butch Jones kind of failed to maybe put that game away. But later on in the season, another 7-point game that they lost is the only loss here. It was 35-28 when they traveled to Baton Rouge. And that was Treon Harris's first start after the Will Greer suspension. In the ugly game where Florida wrapped up the SEC East that year 9-7 against Vanderbilt. And then also another ugly game, a win over FAU in overtime, 20-14. So that was in the first season. That's where a bulk of this comes from. Last year was 13-6 against Vanderbilt and 16-10 against LSU, of course. So we'll go back and kind of talk about that Tennessee game and how being aggressive in that game is what led McElwain to come back and win that game.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't even know that it's necessarily aggressiveness. It's understanding math and percentages. Yeah. It's understanding that when you're down 20-7, so they had a 4th and 6 with 6 minutes left in the third quarter, down 20-7, well within field goal range, probably a 41, 42-yard field goal. And they go for it. They throw a little cross to Powell down to like the 4 or the 5-yard line. Next play, Kelvin Taylor scores a touchdown, and it's 20-14. Right? So you're down by 6 instead of being down by 10. A lot of people would have taken those points because it's 4th and 6, right? Well, we may not make a 4th and 6. And a 4th and 1, maybe people go for it. 4th and 6, do we really need to? We just want to keep it close. And that's not what McElwain does. He decided, hey, 4th and 6, I'm deep in enemy territory. My offense hasn't played well all day. And to that point, they hadn't. And he's like, I may not get down here again, so I need to go for it. And again, when I say strategy and math, I mean, so Butch Jones gets up by 12 and decides to kick an extra point. It's completely inexcusable. You can't do that. It's just malfeasance.
And there was no reason for it whatsoever.
No, it was just stupid. And so, I look at it and I say those types of mistakes aren't made by McElwain. And again, it's not just necessarily being aggressive, because one of the things I highlighted was the game against LSU, where basically they were at a gray area. They were a little bit on the Florida side, somewhere in the 44-yard line. And it was 4th and 4. They're down by a touchdown. And like you said, it's Treon Harris's first game. And he decides to punt. And I actually, when I was going back and looking at the film, was like, ooh, he made a mistake. And then I went and I looked at Brian Burke's analysis that I linked to in the article, where he looks at, when you should go for it, when you should punt, and when you should kick a field goal. And lo and behold, that exact situation is right on the borderline. And when you make a consideration for the fact that it's Treon's first start, and that your defense is as good as it is, and that your offense is struggling, it was the perfect call. They wound up pinning LSU deep. LSU punts it back to Callaway. He returns it for a touchdown. It's 28-28. Again, they don't win that game, but he's making the correct decisions at the correct time to give them mathematically the best chance to score. You can't ask for more than that. Now, you lose by 50 points, and that kind of stuff doesn't matter. And then it gets down to play calling and are your guys prepared and things like that. And those are probably the things I'm most concerned about. Staff is the play calling, and then necessarily being prepared to play from time to time. I know the Michigan bowl game is one of those that sort of stands out when you think about that. So, I'm not saying that McElwain is perfect, but I am saying that in game, if you're in a close game, man, I want that guy making the calls.
Yeah, he does seem to understand in-game situations, and that kind of glad that's what you brought up. And there's even points to where I think there's a high school out there, and there's the high school coach who never punts. I don't, but it never goes for field goals, I believe. He always goes for it on fourth downs. I have to go back and look at it. But I remember reading an article about it about a year or so ago. So
20 onside kicks on every kickoff.
Yeah. And, he said the numbers are there that, they're more successful. I'm sure it's high school. It's much different, quality of competition. You never know how much that plays into it. But, it's and we've seen points to some other things that you were pointing out with McElwain of, how they've been able to come out on first drives of games and look beautiful on the first drive, but then things kind of fall apart after that. So, Nussmeier and McElwain can come together and put together a pretty good early game offensive plan, but for whatever reason, it falls apart there. And some of these games are closer than what they should be, but McElwain still finds a way to come out on top. And as you mentioned, these fourth down conversions that he's been able to make really seem to be a difference maker.
Well, and if you really want to make my point for me, all you really got to do is watch the last 7 minutes of that Georgia and Tennessee game last year. So I went back and watched because I thought I remembered a few coaching mistakes, and wow, it is just a debacle for the last 7 minutes. So there's 7 minutes left. Georgia has 4th and 5 from the Tennessee 36. They punt, and it's a touchback. 16 net yards that they gain, right? So Tennessee drives down the field, and they get up to the Georgia 42, 4th and 6. They decide to punt, and they do pin Georgia deep. So the yardage that they gave up on the punt is really sort of what ended up pinning Georgia deep. Georgia ends up dropping Eason on a deep drop. He gets sacked, and Tennessee scores the touchdown. The ball after a turnover by Georgia. Smart doesn't call a timeout, so he lets 30 or 40 seconds run off the clock. And so that's what caused Georgia to have to throw the Hail Mary at the end with 11 seconds left. Yeah. They should have had more time to get in range, but they didn't because they hadn't called timeout. So the bomb to Ridley comes. It splits two deep coverage where the only guy's job is to keep him in front of him. Then Georgia comes back and goes a pooch kickoff. And gives Tennessee a good
that was the biggest one.
It's how did these guys get head coaching jobs? They can't make a damn decision while they're out there. And so, when people talk to me about Florida and what I expect for this year and all those sorts of things, Florida was the best team in the East last year. The other guys have to play catch up. And these are not rocket science decisions that are being made on the weekends by these guys. I mean, Kirby Smart, I think the jury's still out on whether he can be a good in-game coach. And Butch Jones, I think the jury's already made a decision. So, it was a comedy of errors. I encourage anyone who really wants to look into this stuff further to go watch the last 7 minutes of that game. Because, literally, I was thinking, I'll have one or two examples. And it was every drive was something ridiculous happening. So, anyway, it was a good time because I don't like either of them. But
yeah, there you go. And you know what? And their dumb decisions led to a good finish in a I guess not a great game if you look at what you're saying, but at least it was a great finish. So
it was fun. It was definitely fun, and I can't remember a game where Florida's played, particularly under McElwain, where there's been a back and forth that. Now, part of it is the offense that Florida has not had the capability of going back and forth. If you'd gotten into a shootout, it was going to be a blowout. So certainly Florida's had its warts. I don't think that anybody is going to think that they're a complete product, probably not even this year either. But, when you get in those close games, which each team's going to have a couple of close games every year, even Alabama has a couple of close games. McElwain's the guy you want in charge of those. The other thing I think is interesting is Georgia had 7 close games last year, and Florida only had 2. So Florida went from 5 in McElwain's first year to 2 in his second. And so I think that's a good sign that they are when they were a less talented team 2 years ago, they're playing all these close games, and his in-game decision making makes a huge difference. Now that they're becoming a better team, hopefully they'll be playing less of those. They're still going to have one or two this year, and that may be the difference. Some of those road games we talked about last week, the trap games, Kentucky, Missouri, South Carolina. One decision that swings the game 3-4 points could make a huge difference in whether a team that comes out flat wins the game and wins the East, or whether one of the other teams is celebrating just because of a bad decision a coach made.
For sure. That was a good look by Will there. Yeah, you can check this article, like I said, on SEC Country. New one every Monday. So, and that was the latest one there. So you can go back, and a couple weeks ago, I joined him, and the article was talking about Doug Nussmeier's role at Florida and some other hot debate topics there that Will and I went back and forth on. So, Will, you had a good idea for this show for some over and unders, because from here on out, we'll kind of know what our show is going to be about. We're going to preview the next opponent for Florida and what it means for the Gators. But for this one, you threw out a number of over/under questions that we have here for these Gators, and you sent a list of a good few, and it got me thinking. I was like, oh yeah, this is some good stuff here. We can go back and forth and see what our thoughts are. And the first one that you threw out there would be 2.5 starting quarterbacks for Florida this season. Over or under for that. So you want to go first? Or you want me to go first?
You can go ahead and go first. I'm interested in what you think.
Okay, so maybe we'll flip-flop it every other question. So we'll do it like that. I'm going to say, given the recent histories of injuries and luck and still the uncertainty of who's going to start the season, this one was pretty tough. So, originally I was going to take the over. Florida has, just not had one quarterback to start all season since Tim Tebow's last season. So now McElwain has 3 guys that are capable for different reasons. I do think we see Frank start at some point this season, injuries or no injuries, because the ceiling is the highest with him, and the coaches need to see what he can do in a game scenario. I think there's a chance that McElwain relies on the experience versus Michigan of either Del Rio or Zaire, and they get to start. I don't think it would be Zaire. So I think under that scenario, it would be Del Rio. Eventually, Franks takes over, in my opinion, and never looks back once he gets the starting role. So I don't know when that'll be. Hopefully it'll be early in the season. I do expect him to play versus Michigan, and I'll go out on a limb and say he looks good enough for McElwain to ride with him for the rest of the season. Zaire's a change of pace quarterback that never starts, and he wouldn't either if Del Rio starts versus Michigan. I think if Del Rio or Franks looks to be the starter, I don't think Zaire really ever starts a game for Florida. So I'll say under and just say it'd either be Del Rio and Franks or just Franks all the way.
Interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, the 2.5 number is intentionally designed to make it a little bit difficult, but I'm going to take the over on this one because I think Del Rio probably starts the Michigan game. I think Franks comes in later. I think Zaire probably gets a start somewhere in there, especially if there's an injury. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's a little bit of trickery at some point to open up a game where Kadarius Toney's back there to run Wildcat just to start the game, especially if Florida kicks off, gets a turnover, and then immediately wants to sort of put the defense on its heels. I can envision a scenario where, I hit the over here just because they bring in that change of pace to start the game just because of the way the game happens to go. So I'll take the over here. I think it's a pretty good bet based on the fact that we got a 3-headed monster in camp right now. So that's where I'm going.
Yeah, so McElwain's comments a little bit maybe have steered my question, but I was like, nah, I'll stick with my original thought. So we'll go with that one. Will, I'll throw this one at you first. Over under 1,000 yards for Jordan Scarlett.
Yeah, so I'm going to go under here. I know people think that he's going to be a bell cow and that he's going to be the guy who carries the load. He certainly wants to be that person. He's come out and said that he wants to get the bulk of the carries, and maybe that's the way it goes. But last year he really struggled in pass protection, and if he can't be counted on in pass protection, they're going to bring in other guys on third down. And anytime there's a running play on a short down and distance where they want to try to pick up the first down, and he can't be on the field because he can't be trusted in pass protection, that's going to be an issue. So he had 179 carries last year, 889 yards. So he's going to need about 200 carries with his previous average to hit 1,000. I'll be honest, I think they've got some good talent, and with Malik Davis, it sounded like these guys are really going to get some reps. I think some of them have already passed Mark Thompson on the depth chart.
Yeah.
And the other thing is I think it's a smart thing to limit his carries early in the year, so that when you get into games against LSU and against Texas A&M and against Georgia, you can feed him the ball 20 or 25 times. You don't want him tired because he's been getting hit against against a cupcake. And so, I don't necessarily think you give him the for 150 yards against an inferior opponent. I think you wait to give him that until you get into a big game. And, we saw that last year with LSU, where Pirine and Scarlett were able to take over in the fourth quarter because they were both fresh. And I think that's probably the approach Florida's going to take. They've got some good ones back there. Scarlett's probably the best, but I'm going to take the under on that.
Yeah, in a 12-game season, they had the canceled game last year. I think he would have been, of course, a lot closer to the 1,000 yards from the 889 he had last year. I'll take the over here. He did average 5 yards a carry last year. I do expect with an improved offensive line, I think his average will go up, and his total yards may get off to a slow start versus Michigan. And that might be where it gets a little hairy there. Kind of compare it to limiting his carries last year. He may not get a big number of yards because of their defensive line. But I don't expect to start like last season. If the coaches would have ran him more early last season, instead of taking the running back committee approach, basically like you were saying, I think he probably would have hit that mark last season. So we'll kind of see how the coaching strategy plays into this as well. But I also look for an improved passing game to help alleviate so many guys in the box, to help Scarlett and that offensive line get to the second level and bust some bigger runs. So I think his average maybe goes up a little bit, and I think that's the main factor. I think he hits over 1,000.
No, that's a good point about the long runs. I mean, he was really close to busting them. There's an article earlier this week. I can't remember who wrote it. It might have been Thomas Goldkamp, but that the coaches were talking about having the wide receivers focus on blocking, trying to spring big plays. And, to me, that's a critical component of this, right, is not allowing the corner or the defensive back to come over and trip him up 9 yards downfield, allow him to run for 40.
Yep. Next one. This one was really interesting given the recent events. 50 catches for Antonio Callaway. So I will admit I'm going to cheat on this one. If he's back by the Tennessee game, then I say yes, he gets 50 receptions. If not, then I think the obvious answer is no. And I'll lean that way. I think Callaway misses more time than is announced right now and never really gets an opportunity to hit 50. If he's back by the Tennessee game after having 54 receptions last season, I'd say I'll go over again. Since Florida is deeper at wide receiver than in the past, that might take some receptions from him. But that'd still be, if he comes back around the Tennessee game, still averaging about 5 receptions, or still averaging at 5 receptions a game. My big worry here is, will Nussmeier force the ball to him like he should at points? No idea, but he should do it. We have to see more second half of game production from Antonio Callaway and this offense. Other offensive coordinators out there don't have any problem forcing the balls to their playmakers. They find a way to get their playmakers the ball. Yes, Kadarius Toney may be an X factor here and start taking some of those plays and Massey and Hammond Swain. Like I said, Florida's deep at receivers. That might be where it hurts Callaway the most. If he comes back and has time to hit 50, it's just because of the wide receiver depth. But I think if he's back by the Tennessee game, I say he gets over 50 receptions, but barely.
All right. Well, I'm taking the under on this one because I don't know when he'll come back or if he'll come back. They've obviously kept the suspended players out of all the team photos and all that sort of stuff. And, there are investigations going on, not necessarily of Callaway, but certainly of the players who were sort of involved in this in this credit card incident. And so, I don't know how deep he is in McElwain's doghouse and how hard he's going to have to work to get himself out on the field. Certainly, I think maybe against some of the cupcakes, maybe they don't put him on the field. Just why not just Tennessee, and he'd missed the first 2 games. He had 54 catches last year. That includes the bowl game and the SEC championship game. So it's not as if he was, at 80 catches last year, and 50 is a real stretch. 50 is just halfway to where you think he might end up. I mean, I think that's kind of a stretch for him for a full season. So particularly with the quarterback play and not knowing who that's going to be. So I'll take the under on Callaway with 50 catches. I mean, for a lot of different reasons, but a lot of it just being, you don't know when he's going to come back or if he'll come back. Quite honestly, there might be some conditions he has to, he has to satisfy. And, I do wonder with the money and those sorts of things, there hasn't been much else that's come out about it, but I do wonder whether there's some eligibility concerns with if it's seen as a perk or something like that, is there something tied in there? I have no inside information that says that, but there is, when there's money involved, you always got to wonder about that a little bit.
So true. So true. So we'll keep an ear out for that. We'll see if we hear any more in Antonio Callaway. Here we go. Over under 30 points per game for the offense. They averaged 24 points per game last season. Will, what you got? Over or under 30 points per game for the offense?
I am taking the over on this one. So they were 107th in points per game last year overall. It would be a jump up to 58th to be 30 points per game, right around 58th. So, I wrote an article a while back talking about the probability of offenses improving from, down in the 90 and 100 range. How often do they improve? It's about a 50-50 shot that they would get up to that 58th spot in the country. So you get a little bit of quarterback play. You get 3 or 4 running backs who are effective. The offensive line should be much better this year. That's what we've heard. And so I'm going to take the over. I don't know that they'll be scoring 45, but I can envision a scenario where they're putting up 31 or 32.
Yeah, I think all the home games kind of help here too. Maybe for the offense to kind of find a groove. I'm taking over here as well, because I think this could be a year we see some shootout games for Florida. I think the offenses as a whole in the SEC East are improved, and only Florida and Georgia have the defenses that can be a team strength in the East. So I think the offense improves enough to where games that should be blowouts are blowouts. So that'll help. But Florida getting into a couple shootouts with teams like Tennessee, Kentucky, Mizzou, South Carolina, that also helped the average rise. So I think, given the state of the SEC East and the teams Florida will play, I think shootouts are a little more common coming up this season. I think, Florida may have a quarterback that they can rely on to throw the ball a little bit more than they have been in the past. And I think, with getting more opportunities to more drives per game, I think, for the offense, maybe 1 or 2 more drives a game, I think, they hit that 30-point barrier.
Boy, that is music to my ears. I'm not sure I can take another rock fight with Vandy.
That team has been McElwain's bugaboo for the last. He's won them. Don't get me wrong, but Vandy. They've kind of always played Florida tough. Don't get me wrong. Even I always go back to '96 national championship season. That was one of the toughest games Florida for that whole season. So. Next one, kind of along the same lines, is the 22 points per game for the defense. Previous 2 seasons, last season, 16.8 points per game. 2015, it was up to 18.3. I'll go over here as well, but not by much. I do expect this defense not to be as good as the last couple of defenses. A lot of the talent has moved on to the NFL. I think you're doing those guys a disservice a little bit if you expect no drop off. I do think by season's end, this defense can be what we expect to see year in and year out of a Florida defense. I expect a little bit of a slow start and adjustment period, kind of because of what I said just previously, is because I think the SEC East offenses are going to be a little better. So in the end, I say they give up around 20 points per game, and that should be good for about 23 points per game. That's where I'll go. So, like I said, over, but not by much. That should still be good for around the top 20 defense.
Hey, we disagree. I'm going under here.
Oh.
So I've been beating the drum on thinking their defense is going to take a step back. Based on all the guys they've lost to the NFL and now the Marcel Harris injury. But you look at their schedule and they only have 1 road game.
Yeah.
Until they get to game 9. So you look at that and say, all right, well, if you've only got 1 road game and you've got 2 neutral site games and everything else is in the swamp, I really expect the crowd noise to help those guys early on. And then by the time you get to the end, I think they're really talented. So, I don't think the talent is what's in dispute. I think it's the experience. And the more I look at the schedule, the more I think, maybe they struggle against Michigan to start with. Maybe they struggle a little bit against Tennessee. But again, that game's in the swamp. And then by that point, those guys are starting to hit their stride, and I can see, clamping down on LSU and Texas A&M and Georgia and that sort of stretch right in there. So I'm going to go under. It won't be a whole lot, I don't think, 20 or 21 points per game, but
yeah.
That's sort of in that 20th ranked defense range. I think that's probably right. 22 points per game would be 22nd in the country last year is what that would have been. I think that's probably a little bit high.
Yeah, I had about 23. So yeah, it's we're right around that same range. So about a field goal difference we see for this for this Gator defense. So
Yeah, but that
per game.
makes a
Yeah,
huge difference over the season, right? I mean, if they can get over
sure.
30 points and they can get under 20 given up, I mean,
Oh yeah,
they're gonna go 9-3, 10-2. I mean,
yeah,
that makes a huge difference.
for sure. Well, this one I found pretty interesting. This one you sent here, over under 4 touchdowns for Kadarius Toney.
Yeah, so I'm going way over here because I am a Tony Homer. Like I love that guy. I've watched his tape. The ball doesn't always come out of his hand nice, but man, is he effective? And so I think they're going to have some trick plays for him to throw the ball. I think we're going to see him against Michigan. I think they're probably going to come out after he's come in the game and made a couple of runs. You bring him in the red zone, and you've got some opportunities to maybe run some read option with Scarlett. So I think 4 touchdowns is easy for this guy. I think there's going to be 4 or 5 opportunities in each game where they can bring him in where he might be able to break one. We saw this with Tebow against LSU with the jump pass, right? I mean,
Yeah,
everybody was crashing the line, and you've got a wide open Tate Casey coming behind the back. And I think there's going to be opportunities for those sorts of plays. So, running the football, maybe he doesn't have 4 touchdowns, but he's going to be playing some receiver. So he might actually just get him conventionally, but then you put him in the Wildcat, you give him an opportunity to throw. I think he's going to get it pretty easily.
yeah. Quick note on that. I was about 10 feet away on the sideline with that jump pass, and I tell you what, that was like one of the craziest moments ever. And being that close to it, I was just like an amazement there.
Oh
uh,
man, I was in the stands, so
yeah.
you had a much better vantage point than I did.
It was yeah, it was crazy. I had a camera in my hand though, so it was I was seeing it through a camera lens. So yeah, I'm going to take the over here as well. At the wide receiver position, Callaway only led the way with 3 receiving touchdowns last year, and he also had 1 rushing, so that gave him 4 for last year. I think Toney, even as a freshman, will be counted on this offense to be an X factor, somewhere where the defense will have to know where he's lined up. I expect him to be, much like you said, a red zone weapon, and for that reason, I expect him to get a few touchdowns to help in that area of a pass problem for the Gators. And I didn't know if you were counting total TDs or not, Will, but I'll even say, much like you said, he throws one out of a Wildcat package or some type of trick play or whatever, where you're throwing screen after screen after screen to him or whatever, and then he just pulls up and pops one and hits the receiver down the field. So I think they're going to find many ways to use Kadarius Toney, and 4 touchdowns. We might have to say 4 touchdowns over or under by midway through the season or something like that.
Well, we're definitely beating our 30 points per game if that's happening.
Uh, for sure. Another one along the same lines is 3 interceptions for Chauncey Gardner. I'm going to take the over on this one as well. I think the coaches are going to line him up to be a playmaker on the defense. I expect one or some of the freshmen to eventually give the coaches enough confidence to move Chauncey to the middle of the field and be a playmaker and change the game with interceptions to help this offense out. I expect 4 to 5 interceptions for him through the season. He had 2 in 3 of the last 3 games of last season. 2 of those came in the bowl game against Iowa. So, I think coaches got enough glimpse to see what kind of playmaker Chauncey Gardner will be, and will try and line him up wherever they can to get more game-changing interceptions.
Yeah, Gardner's an awesome player, but I'm taking the under on this one mainly because last year you had to throw to Gardner because he's the freshman. He's out there on the field, and then you've got Marcel Harris at one safety. You got Wilson and Tabor on the outside. If you're going to try to pick on somebody, you're going to try to pick on that guy. Now, I think he proved that you don't want to pick on him, but now people know you don't want to pick on him, and there's going to be a whole different set of people out there that you can pick on. And so, with the injury to Harris, it sounds like Washington is nursing an injury right now too, the other safety. And so, there are going to be other people you can pick on. You can dictate who you go to based on your offensive formations and really sort of what Florida's going to do. If they put Gardner up back in center field, you can run some routes that just prevent, that just take him out of the game from that standpoint. So, because I think he's the guy that offensive coordinators are going to say, we don't want to let him beat us, that they're going to tell their quarterbacks, you need to know where he is every time before the snap, pre-snap read. He's the guy you got to pay attention to. And so, I just don't think he's going to get the opportunities that he had last year. And so that's why I'm taking the under.
Gotcha. I like that reason in there. That was some good stuff. This one was a little tough as well. You had 3 Gators, or first or second team All-American list, and you mentioned CBS currently had 3 on the second team, and that was Martez Ivy, Duke Dawson, Eddie Pinheiro. What you got for that one? Over or under 3 Gators on first or second team All-American list?
Yeah, so I have Florida being pretty good this year, so I'm going to take the over on that. I think Jawan Taylor has an opportunity to potentially be on there. I think McCoy, the center, has an opportunity to be there, and I think one of the defensive ends, either CC Jefferson or Antonius Clayton, is gonna step up, and we're really going to see somebody on that defensive line be the feared guy that defenses have to account for. So, you factor that in with Pinheiro, who I think probably, hell, he's kicking 70-yard field goals in practice, and Duke Dawson again. I struggle with that one as well because I'm not sure he's going to get as many opportunities, but I think they're going to get over 3 on the first or second team All American because I think Florida's going to be pretty good this year, and I think that there are some areas that maybe didn't get on the All American team this year, but if Florida wins the East again, then they're going to get the attention.
I'll take the under here. I think it stays with 2, and I think it's 2 of the ones that were mentioned already, Dawson and Pinheiro. I think Ali will be good at tackle, but I don't think he'll be one of the best in the nation there. I will say players to watch out for that could end up on the list, and I agree with you, CC Jefferson. He's probably the one that I was going back and forth on with this. And, I was trying not to make it a push, so that's where we were going with that. Yeah, so if I had to say, I would say I would probably put CC Jefferson on the list too, but just to avoid a push, I went no. I do expect a huge year from him and to be a force along the defensive line. Chauncey Gardner, just because I'm pretty high on him for reasons I stated earlier. I think he's one to watch out for. David Reese, the guy I think he could sneak up on the list. I think he can take that next step, build on the unexpected experience that he got last year and the great coaching by Rainey Shannon by putting him in position to be the linebacker that can be the rock of this defense. And then on the offensive side of the ball, I think watch out for Tyree Cleveland. He's bigger this year, added some more weight. He'll be the top target of this offense with Callaway missing some time. And if Callaway returns, he'll help him even more. So DBs will have to worry about both. So I think Tyree Cleveland is the one guy as a skill player on offense that I'd watch out for.
Yeah, the other one I forgot was our punter, Johnny Townsend. So,
true. Yeah.
I think he got robbed last year with some of those awards. I think he was better than some of the guys who won the awards. Probably should have been on the All-American team last year. Certainly had a lot of experience punting last year.
Yeah.
So
forgive me for that because you're right. I mean, he probably definitely should be on the list. And there's a popular saying out there on Twitter: punters are people too. So I forgot that. Sorry. But yeah, Townsend is definitely one of, if not the best punter in the nation. As we get closer to the game, Will, you had this one out here as well. 45 total points for Florida, Michigan. Over or under 45 total points. I'm going to take the under here as I think the score will be 24-20. One of the teams. I'll make the official pick next week. I think both offenses will be trying to figure out the opposing defenses out as neither offense will be quite in sync yet. I think both coaches will not put their quarterbacks in bad positions to play the game safe. Now, the one thing I think could blow this out of the water is both secondaries are filling in new players and trying to figure out the best combinations back there. That could lead to some big plays by these quarterbacks. So, while these quarterbacks may not be thought of as the best passers in the nation, going against secondaries that are still trying to figure some things out, some big plays can be made. But I'll still say under with a score of 24-20. I'm leaning in Florida, but I'll make my official pick next week. But we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I'm taking the over. I think it's pretty strong over for the very reasons you said, that Florida and Michigan are both just replacing an immense amount of talent on defense, both teams. And so you look at it and say, all right, well, are they going to be able to get pressure? We don't really know. Are the linebackers gonna maintain their gaps? We don't know. Can the defensive backs cover? We don't know. So if you're gonna have me take one or the other, I'm taking the over on this one. I don't know what the final score is going to be, and I'll certainly give my prediction next week. But I think we're going to see some breakdowns. I think we're going to see some big plays. I think this may be one of those games that we were talking about earlier that we haven't seen Florida in, where they're going back and forth just because both teams are inexperienced and talented, but the talent, the speed that gets you into the play is also the one that gets you out of the play if you pick the wrong gap. So I'm going to take the over on this one.
I hear you on that. And then kind of, the big thing here, taking the season as a whole, over or under, Will, let you start with this one. 8 wins for the Gators for 2017.
Yeah, I'm taking the over. And there are a lot of reasons why, but I think the extra home game from LSU makes a huge deal or makes a big difference. The 3 true road games that they have are against teams that are relatively inferior by SEC standards, so Missouri, Kentucky, South Carolina. Those road games don't come till late in the season, at least most of them. I just look at it and say I think the schedule sets up for more than 8 wins. And to be honest, I think that the offense is going to be better. I think the offensive line that has just been a sieve, particularly particularly on the road last year, don't have to deal with that this year. So, or at least not as much. So, I think the schedule sets up pretty well. I think the talent is getting better. And to be honest, I'm not sure anybody else in the SEC East is all that good, which means Florida ought to be, 6-1 in their division, and so, or 7-1 in their division. So, if they can pull that out, then I think that they're going to be fine, and they're going to come out with at least 9 wins.
That's kind of how I see it too. I will say the over as well. 9-3, 10-2. I think is depending on the Michigan game. There, I do see. Now, I won't say the floor is 9 wins. The Florida can be a little worse than that. But if you're asking me to pick, I will say at least 9-3 for the Gators. I think it's kind of hard to pick exactly where the losses will come for Florida because they can. I'm not saying they will. So don't somebody quote me out there for that. They can win every game on the schedule. I don't see it playing out that way. One loss I do, and I know fans are going to kill me for this one. One loss I do have pegged right now is Florida State. I still don't see Florida being ready to beat Florida State. I hope I'm wrong, but you also have the tough games: Michigan, Tennessee, LSU, Georgia. You probably can throw A&M in there. I just don't know where they'll be mentally at that point in the season. Florida will have to avoid the upset to teams like Kentucky, South Carolina, Missouri. But McElwain has a good history of winning the games he's supposed to. Maybe last year's Arkansas game is probably the one game I point to where, I didn't expect the team to show up like that. So, given McElwain's history at Florida so far in his first 2 years, I think 9-3 is the groundwork, the foundation to be laid for this season. Go out there and get a couple more wins.
Yeah, I don't think the floor is. I mean, the floor is probably 7.
Yeah,
but that's with everything going wrong. But the ceiling, actually, the more I look at it, is pretty high, right? Because if someone is in trouble when Texas A&M comes, I'm not real impressed with Orgeron as a head coach.
Nope.
We've already gone over the coaching limitations of Smart, Butch Jones, and then you've got Muschamp at South Carolina, who didn't impress me when he was at Florida either. So, I don't know that we're going up against a murderer's row of head coaches here. We don't have to play Alabama, at least not until it really counts. So I think the ceiling actually, I guess if you'd asked me a month ago, I might have, before looking at the schedule real closely, I might have said the ceiling was maybe 10 at the most. They might be able to sneak out in 11th. And if you're going into Florida State and you haven't lost yet, that's a pretty successful season.
Oh, for sure. That sets up a Florida State game of old. These last two kind of have been too. Florida hasn't been terrible, but we've known the limitations. Even though they were going into that game with a pretty good record, there were still some limitations there that we knew when Florida was going head to head against Florida State there. So, but yeah, I kind of agree. And I said it. And Florida can win every game. I don't think they will, but they can. And that's what you expect at Florida. And you expect to go into every game with a chance to win. And that's what Florida football has been about for the last few decades.
Yeah, well, and I guess what we really probably want to look for is halfway through the season, what does the progression look like? If they can get through that first half of the season unscathed, then you're in a really nice position, both because of who you're playing, but also because all those young guys all of a sudden now really aren't freshmen anymore. And so, you have the ability now to rely on them where maybe you'd be reticent to do so in the first half. So I think we'll know 6 games in what we've got. At least in terms of whether it's an SEC contender or whether it's an SEC East contender. And that's really sort of the next step for Florida, right, is going from being an SEC East contender to being an SEC contender. So it's going to be fun.
It will be. It will be for sure. Next week we'll have a guest on to bring and talk about info for the Michigan game. A guy who runs a Michigan podcast, so that's the name of it. It's called the Michigan Podcast. So we'll get him on here and discuss the Michigan game with us, and we'll try and have a guest every Wednesday on with Will and I to break down the game. But if not, we'll break it down for what we can. Probably won't have one for Northern Colorado and UAB and all that. I think we can get through those ourselves and what we expect from the Gators, but. We will really look forward to getting you here every Wednesday and preparing and talking about these opponents that the Gators are going to be playing week in and week out.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate you giving me the platform. It's a lot of fun to talk about Florida football, whether winning or losing. It's a passionate fan base, and it's fun to get involved. And certainly, thanks to everybody on Twitter for engaging us and sending questions our way and commenting. And I'd love to hear everybody's opinions on the over-unders, because I'm sure I don't get called an idiot enough, so I could use some more of it on Twitter.
I ruffled some feathers a little bit before this episode. I threw out defending Luke Del Rio a little bit. So, don't get me wrong. You can go out there and find the tweet, but, just sparking some conversation is really all that was for. So, it's fun to talk as long as people want to do it the right way. So that's what we try and bring out there with our tweets and the podcast here.
Yeah, well, and I will say that as much as maybe the Luke Del Rio experience was unpleasant last year, it's been nice to see a lot of the Florida faithful rally around him, particularly with some of the stuff he's said recently. Whether you agree with him or you don't, he speaks his opinion, and we tend to criticize athletes when they just speak the company line, and Del Rio doesn't do that. So. Again, if he goes out there and puts up 40 points, nobody's going to complain. So, it'll be interesting to see who goes out there. And if it's Del Rio, I'm going to cheer for him, just like I would for Frankster Zaire.
For sure. Just remember, we're all goldfish. So, all right. So for Will Miles, you can find them on Twitter at Will Miles SEC and on stccountry.com. You can find those articles there. I'm David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Thanks for listening to this episode of Gators Breakdown.